Okay, hello everybody. Share screen. All right, and we're gonna play from here. All right, so I'm doing the prologue here. We'll get to Ukraine, I hope, and maybe get it to 2014 when everything went crazy. But I'm thinking ahead a little bit, and I'm just floating a trial balloon here on what we might do when we're done with Ukraine or the Silk Road or whatever. And this is, I've just been batting this around. And what I'm gonna, this is the text. They use it at DVC, and this guy, James Rawls, he is, I think, a very good historian on California. And so I'll send around a very, very detailed table of contents. And you all can take a look at that table of contents and see if it's something you might be interested in doing. Okay, I'm going to start off with an article Barbara sent, which I thought was really good. And it kind of summarizes the question that Bob brought up about, hey, the world's not with us. And in summary, still no African country has placed sanctions on Russia. South Africa, well, is really suspicious of NATO for some reason. Only 3 Asian countries have. The Middle East, where we've got a lot of investment, Israel and Saudi Arabia are not punishing Moscow in any way or sanctions. India is even negotiating to buy oil from Putin at cut rates. So why? Well, I think ideological, a lot of people have not forgotten about our misbehavior in Iraq, where we defied the international law and the United Nations. And we've been involved in a lot of coups against leftist leaders, going all the way through the Cold War. And so there's even some leftist sentiment for old Soviet aid. But more practical material reasons: food, energy, and weapons. They're client states of Russia, dependent on Russia. For if not Russian wheat, then Ukrainian wheat. This is the planting season. They're worried that these sanctions that we're putting on Russia is going to raise food prices for them in general. So that's a problem. And then a lot of emerging countries feel that their needs have not been met in the context of climate change financing. We've here, the rich West has created the problem with the over consumption of energy, and we're not helping them as much as we should, since we're the ones that created it. And also COVID. We're maybe, I think in their eyes, we were a little bit slow in helping them out. And you look back on the last century, European wars were just devastating. And it's like, uh-oh, here we go again. We've talked about NATO's expansion, and that bothers them too. And how stable is the United States? What if Trump wins the next election? So there's a lot of reasons why we're not getting much response. But I want to dwell a little bit on the security ties to Russia. So it's obvious in Syria, front and center, Russian troops are there. Also, apparently, Egypt gets a lot of security aid in the Gulf. I want to do a little bit of a dive on this Wagner Group that you keep reading about. They're active in Libya and most recently in Mali and all these other countries, including in our hemisphere, Venezuela. What about the Monroe Doctrine? And Ukraine, especially beginning in 2014. So what is the Wagner Group? So there's all these definitions. I won't go through them, but just to mention, it's kind of like Putin's private army. And they are front and center, particularly in the Central African Republic, where they're the security guard for the president. And there's Central Africa has even put up a monument honoring the Wagner Group. So who are they? This is their logo, and this is kind of scary. That's for sure. They're shadowy. It allows Putin this plausible deniability. They're not Russian troops. Who are they? They're the veterans of Chechen wars started this group. And according to The Economist, it's named after Richard Wagner, the composer who was a passionate fascist. And it may be them that's assassinating the political leaders and not the Russian army itself, what we've seen in the Ukraine. Their founder is this guy, Utkin, and Economist reports he's got Nazi tattoos. And here's a compilation of some of his moments being close to power. Yeah, Putin, private killers is unprecedented. No, it is precedented. We used contract military people in Iraq. And this is from a Washington Post study that saying Washington likes to use contract military because it just wants to not publicize the true costs of war. They've been on the scene in Iraq from the beginning. I had a medical colleague who went to Iraq as a volunteer to help train EMT people, and he talked about his encounter with these guys. So the thing here is they have a different demography than the average U.S. active duty soldier. They're more male and they're more white. The other interesting thing is they're less educated when it comes to high school graduation, but there are a group of them that have gone to college that's higher than the average for the soldiers. All right, so end of the Wagner Group tangent. We'll go back to the countries that aren't supporting sanctions, and a lot of them, they're just hedging, waiting for the war to be over. A few interesting ones, Cuba and Nicaragua, you'd think would be surefire supporters of Russia, but they've been abstaining, interestingly enough. Not sure why. Mexico and Brazil, their position is don't condemn Moscow too harshly. You shouldn't break off communication, isolate the criminal. They're not for it, but they're playing their cards close to their chest. There's only a small core of usual suspects that actually support Russia. China is a little bit more nuanced, that they just don't like to see interference. So that's funny, right? Because they don't want to participate in sanctions because that's a bad precedent. But if they're worried about countries invading other countries, how in the world did they sign on for this? And everybody suspects that they have Taiwan in mind, but who knows?
Can you go back one slide? I just want to see that last bottom line. Yeah, the hardcore Syria, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Algeria, Eritrea.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So a participant who watches the video, he's from a generation younger than us, and he has been making regular contributions. And this week, he sent something on Russian self-conception, the core beliefs of the average Russian person. And there may be a warm spot for the old empire, the old Russian Empire, the colonialism that implied. And he talks about famous people who've been a voice in favor of Russian hegemony. And Pushkin was an arch nationalist and a colonialist, which I find interesting. The other interesting thing about Pushkin that I've always been fascinated by was his African ancestry. So that's explained by his great-grandfather, who was abducted as a child from the Cameroon and taken to Istanbul, and the Sultan gave his great-grandfather to Peter the Great. So this is I don't know if our Silk Roads book will cover this, but this is a very interesting transaction here. And it also shows Russian tolerance, multiculturalism, which you could argue that their empire was, particularly when it took in the steppes and finally conquered the steppes. And in Putin's biography, there are many times when he encounters white nationalists, and he puts them down and says, that's not Russia. Russia is multicultural. So it's hard to think of nice things to say about Putin, but there you go. And this is a serious hero. These people come out to mark the 180th anniversary. Who keeps track of the 180th anniversary of somebody dying? But there they are out at paying tribute. Solzhenitsyn is also a nationalist. He was certainly against Soviet brutality, but still he believed in Russian hegemony. And then there's an interesting immigrant, a Russian-American poet who came here in the 70s and eventually was named the American Poet Laureate, Joseph Brodsky. And look what he writes. He writes an ironic poem in 1992 when Ukraine decides to go its own way and not join the Commonwealth that Russia and Belarus are creating. And he even uses a racial slur again that's used against Ukrainians. His language is spitting in the Dnipro River, and that the Ukrainians are ungrateful. On their deathbeds, they'll revert to reciting Pushkin. Pretty harsh stuff. All right, and then Bob Kelso sends this interesting video on YouTube, How Russia Will Die. He is a geopolitical thinker, all right? And he focuses a lot on demography and the Russian birth rate, and dwells on that quite a bit. And so he has a very well received book called The Accidental Superpower, well reviewed, and I think it was interesting to watch, and it reminds me of another geopolitical analyst that Ramsey has quite often referenced, Robert Kaplan. And he just points out Ukraine is open on three sides and they're doomed to be in a sphere of influence. They don't have any natural borders with Russia. And so he's a realist, and in the mold of Henry Kissinger, who he quotes as saying that the ideal must nod to the achievable. That's the realists school in geopolitical analysis. And he had a very nice podcast with The Economist, where he's the author of The Revenge of Geography. So that geography is often determinative. And think about our little travel through the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, and how in the end, geography played a huge role with all those mountains and valleys, and the difficulty of a central government to control the periphery. So our experience in Afghanistan would reinforce this look at politics and what's determinative. And then he continues to write essays, Kaplan does, and basically he's making the point that we started off with, that why are emerging countries not supporting this? All right. So I complimented Putin for being a multiculturalist and standing up to the white nationalism. But here he is actually paying tribute at the funeral of the biggest white nationalist of all, this guy Zhirinovsky. He came on the radar in the 90s, right after communism fell. And he's been a scary guy that's been close to power, but he's always had enough of a role to be a kingmaker of sorts. But he's scary. He advocated using nuclear weapons against Chechnya. And he really wants Moscow to reestablish its former empire. And Putin came out of his hibernation. You know, he keeps his distance from people. Some people say he's afraid of COVID. Zhirinovsky may have died of COVID. That's the rumor. So interesting. So Ramsey weighed in one of the dialogues, and I'm just going to make quickly a few brief points. I put up his actual words in case anybody wants to review it on the video. But their question was, is China in deep crisis? And he basically thinks the whole world's in deep crisis, that it's like the 4th century. Just before the Huns and the barbarians overtook Europe and China and India. He looks at religious leaders as really not providing much in the way of inspiration. Maybe we need another wave of religious leaders like we had in the Axis era, where all those religious leaders that we talked about, 7 or 8, emerged within 100 years, responding to the violence that had come from the introduction of iron. And so, but right now, the religious leaders seem more focused on self-preservation. We've certainly seen that in Russia. And what he is hoping for is some kind of a reset on global rules, like we had towards the end of World War II with the Bretton Woods agreement that gave us all these international institutions like the World Bank and the UN. So he's hoping for that, and he says it'll probably come out of East Asia. So what are we to do? We may not live long enough to see that happen, but his prescription, I think, will resonate with some of us. Help our grandkids and be active in voter registration, which I know almost everybody in this group is. So a nod to Ramsey. Germany. I've got to just comment on some issues with Germany. It's been amazing how much they've turned around since Merkel left, with a socialist leader in league with the Green Party and the Libertarians. The remarkable. Nevertheless, there are a couple of holdouts that I want to bring to our attention. And it really, Germany started looking to the East in the 1970s. I remember because I lived there in the early 60s, and Willy Brandt was the mayor of Berlin when I lived there. And in the 70s, he became chancellor and said, okay, they may be communists, but it's time to start talking to them. And he did. And this was one of the first baby steps, really, towards the fall of communism. So I bring it up because a former chancellor is playing footsie with Putin even now. Gerhard Schroeder, and he was a socialist. He was the head of the German Socialist Party when he was chancellor. But when he retired, he opened his wallet to see what, and he started striking deals with Russia using his influence. Here he is with his first wife. She's not going to last, but Putin. It was Dan again that alerted to his lucrative dealings, and that it was quite typical for a lot of German export industry that they were lobbying to use Russian energy so Russia could repay for the exports that German industry was making, and that Schroeder was the tip of the iceberg. But he's getting $1 million. He's become a pariah in Germany. His own city of origin, Hanover, he had to resign his honors there before the city could strip him of it. Even the Socialist Party of Deutschland has taken off a mug that they used to sell with Schroeder's name on it. So The Economist says none of this has pricked Mr. Schroeder's conscience, assuming he has one. But an interesting development is he has popped up in Moscow recently with his fifth wife, a Korean economist and interpreter. And if you think about it, okay, if you need a go-between, this may be the guy, maybe better than Abramovich, who we talked about before. And remember, Putin speaks German. He was in Dresden for 5 years and speaks German. So maybe something might happen. How do we know he's there? The only evidence is his wife's Instagram, where she shows herself meditating with St. Basil's in the background. I just think it's interesting these days how much of the news is on social media, and a lot of intelligence on social media. The Ukrainian troops got a lot of information on from social media on Ukrainians, just saying, "Hey, I saw a column of soldiers just go by." So it's nebulous. We don't know. He has influence, but is he there just to polish up his image? We won't know until it happens. I just want to review a little bit of history through the eyes of Schroeder, and we can also just review and get up to where we stopped last time. We talked about 2007 when Estonia took down that war memorial to the Soviet soldiers that insulted Putin so much, and they paid the price with all these computer tricks. And now Estonia is one of the masters of crypto computer stuff. But Schroeder said Estonia had contradicted every form of civilized behavior when they took down the memorial to the Russian soldier. He also chided the West for being so quick to recognize Kosovo. You remember they became independent from Serbia, one of Russia's client states, also Orthodox Christian. And then the 2008 Georgia-Russian war over South Ossetia, he blamed Saakashvili and even American conniving for that war. And even in Crimea, which is indefensible, he played a little bit about whataboutism, looking at NATO's intervention in 1999 in Kosovo, where NATO was bombing the center of Europe without UN approval. So that's where Schroeder was on the events that we've been discussing. So back to the Ukraine. You'll remember at the end of that war, where Russia pushed Georgia out of South Ossetia, George W. Bush responded and mentioned that we should give the Ukraine and Georgia NATO membership. And that only threw gasoline onto the fire. The Russians themselves looked at their performance in Georgia. It was the first large-scale military operation in a long time, and they realized they had a problem. And one wonders if they'll have another post-mortem after this war. And so it had been a 5-day limited military operation, and Putin's not calling his invasion a war; is forbidding people to call it a war. And Russian casualties were very high, as they are now, and they went back to the drawing board. And they wanted to be ready for the next opportunity, which was, in fact, the Ukraine. So Putin is constantly thinking about the Ukraine now, ever since getting a bloody nose in 2004 in the Orange Revolution. And he has to leave office as president in 2008. So he switches jobs with his prime minister for 4 years, but he does obey the letter of the law. Now, later on, he's going to actually change the Constitution, but in 2008, he didn't think he had enough political capital to actually change the Constitution, so he left the presidency. And in 2009, Albania and Croatia start their joining of NATO, and the same meeting was in 2009. They endorsed George W. Bush's proposal that Ukraine and Georgia be admitted. And then there was a fourth wave of Montenegro and North Macedonia joining in 2017 over Russia's strong objections. So we got it doesn't excuse anything, but we got to at least acknowledge that there were things going on that would make other Russians, not just Putin, feel threatened. But in 2009, Hillary Clinton was our Secretary of State. By the way, she was one of the most popular Secretary of States that we had, and you would have thought that popularity would carry over to 2016, but somehow she was demonized. But her whole notion with Russia was, let's reset. Let's forget about the Orange Revolution and what happened there, and what happened in Georgia, and let's just start over again. Reboot your computer. And Putin received Obama at his private residence. Here's Michael McFaul. He's going to be in our future slides. And here he is in the Security Council as the Russian expert. I think the place occupied by Fiona Hill most recently. But by 2010, Hillary's responded to the actions of NATO and said, well, sure, Ukraine, the door is open. And they're going to be, with Georgia, part of the fifth wave, maybe. 2010, interesting development. So if you think back to 2004, this guy, Yankovic, had won the first round, but everybody said he cheated, and they forced a rerun, and then the Orange Revolution candidate defeated him in 2004, and that was the Orange Revolution. Well, he and Putin bided their time, and he makes a comeback, and successful one, in 2010. And then the Orange Revolution successor candidate was Yulia Tymoshenko. And why couldn't the original guy run again? I'll show you in just a second. But remember, Yankovic, his strength was in the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. So it was, and Yushchenko, his strength was in the West. But in the rerun, Yankovic wins. This was his adversary in 2004, you'll remember. And the price of success in 2004 was you get poisoned with dioxin. People of the time said, well, we can't prove that it was the Russians, but in 2022, the likelihood is changed looking back. Now, in Russia in 2011, 2012, there's a snow revolution. What's that? That is the Russians themselves approaching the election of 2012. So Putin is going to run again, as president. He's prime minister at this time. And they're saying, we want fair elections. We want to make sure that if Putin runs, that it's going to be fair. And what's their beef? Authoritarianism, rigged elections, lack of civil liberties, corruption, political repression, and the same as the other color revolutions. And Putin's response was counter revolutions. He has, as we can see, a real fear of color revolutions. And people are quite frank, saying, we don't want any orange protests here. And he calls out all his friends, all the Securocrats, the Siloviki, and the church, the clerics that we've talked about before. This is when they became very, very active. Navalny was a part of this demonstration on the other side. And he made the point, there's so much corruption that you require a lot of religion to erase all the corruption that we see. And Navalny makes a video. He smuggles a camera into Putin's palace in Sochi, and to bring home just how corrupt Putin is. And that you need a lot of ideology, a lot of religion to cover up palaces like Putin's in Sochi. So Putin strikes back, and now he's really mad at Clinton. And he writes an op-ed for the New York Times saying Hillary Clinton was behind all the opposition to me. And the sort of things that maybe we were saying about Putin in our election of 2016. And he talks about the Ukraine in 2004, and our people do not want something like that. So obviously the reset has failed. Hillary names McFaul as the ambassador, 2012, 2014. And that really is putting gasoline on the fire. And Putin treats him shabbily. And I think any of you have heard McFaul, who's now at Stanford, talk about his experiences. You know, there was no love lost. So here is McFaul testifying, House Foreign Affairs Committee. Just remember this woman, okay? Bill Browder, we're going back to 2005 now to tell you what was going on with the Russian economy. It looked like it was a free market shareholder economy. So Bill Browder, an American investor, he gets involved. He said, this is an opportunity. And he comes in as a shareholder rights activist. So obviously the oligarchs are not going to like this kind of activism in their companies. In retaliation for what he's doing, he's thrown out of the country. All his offices are raided in Moscow. He's got a big company, a lot of investment, but Putin throws him out. Now he strikes back. He's got a lawyer, a Russian lawyer, who specializes in Russian tax law, corporate tax, and he has his lawyer Magnitsky go and do some sleuthing to see what the police were doing. And Magnitsky finds out that the undercover agents have fraudulently re-registered some of their shares. He's arrested and he dies in prison. This is Magnitsky. So Browder does not take this lying down, and he becomes an activist. And he's written a book, a couple of books now. He's interviewed. He was interviewed on by Fareed Zakaria recently, and he's very successful activist and gets the Congress and Obama to sign the Magnitsky Act, which bars any of the Russian officials believed to be involved in any of the bad stuff that happened to Browder, to get them barred from visiting the United States or using our banking system. And the EU follows suit, and Browder's in the audience and receives applause in the EU. And so now all these oligarchs have had already in 2012 their freedom in using their resources severely constricted. They can't use American banking system. And how much does Putin feel that? So much that this woman who's been stalking McFaul asks for a meeting in Trump Tower with Donald Trump, Kushner, and Manafort. They all show up. Trump's story initially is, well, we thought it was about adoptions, but everybody knows that's baloney. And I think there was some emails and tapes that proved that they were there because she was promising dirt on the Hillary Clinton campaign. And that's when Don Jr. says, if it is what you say it is, I love it. And it turns out adoptions were not bought up, and she very quickly went to the Magnitsky Act, and would Trump please reverse that? So Putin was feeling the pain. The oligarchs were feeling the pain enough to get involved in something like this. So what was the aftermath of all the protests? Putin wins, and now there's 2012, 2013 suppression and arrests. And Boris Navalny, who we're all familiar with in the recent the documentary from CNN. But there's another guy, Nemtsov, and I want to talk a little bit about him. These are the leaders, but all the people who'd been out in the street, the working class protesters are intimidated now and alienated. But it wasn't always so. Here's Nemtsov in 2000 with a Putin who's just taken power. And Nemtsov is a player in the parliament. And he winds up at Davos, and he winds up in front of Obama as late as 2009. And then he marches for peace and persists. Even after they lose the election, he's still out on the front lines in 2014. And what happens to him? He gets murdered on the Bolshoi-Moscow bridge. And here are people paying tribute. within the shadow of the Kremlin, he's murdered. And it turns out that there is an anti-Semitic component to some of this. Both Nemtsov and, you'll remember, Chubais, the Chubais brothers, and some anti-Semitism emerges. And of course, Chubais was responsible for shock therapy. So there's some of that bitterness that comes out now. And here's Navalny. We know the details from the CNN documentary in court. We know he got poisoned with Novichok. And finally, through the heroic efforts of his wife, she extracts him from the Russian medical system and gets him to Berlin. And he's discharged a month later, and we all know he returns, knowing he's going back to the Gulag. Now, 2014 is what we're up to, just one baby step back to 2013. Yankovic somehow got convinced that he should sign an EU letter of intent. The parliament in the Ukraine was alive and well and enough to get him to sign that. But after he signs it, Putin starts pressuring him and says, hey, you've got to, instead of going with the EU, you've got to join our new vision of the Commonwealth, which is going to recreate the Russian Empire. And I don't know. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. Putin's intent to get Yankovic to pull out of that deal, Yankovic's enthusiasm for pulling out of that deal. It must have been an offer he couldn't refuse. So when Yankovic relents and reneges on the EU letter of intent, then this is when everybody in the Ukraine that does not want to be Russian comes out against this bailout deal, which they see basically as a bribe of Yankovic to try to yank Ukraine back into the Russian sphere of influence. And so you get the Maidan Protests. Maidan is a Persian word meaning square or open space. So maybe we'll see that in our Silk Roads book, the Maidan. And this is Victoria Nuland, Hillary's right-hand woman in the politics of Eastern Europe. And she goes down to the Maidan Square with donuts and cookies. This really enrages Putin. Imagine if in our Occupy movement, if the Russian ambassador had taken food down to Wall Street to give to the Occupy movement. It's like that. But it turns into a big revolution, the dignity revolution. It gets violent. And some people would say, but you know, Yankovic and the Russians, they had a point. Yankovic had been elected, and it was a coup. Well, again, Yankovic had seen that he had to make some change, and so they sat down and brokered a deal. This foreshadows the Minsk negotiation, where the outside parties agreed, and this included Russia, that there would be new presidential elections at the end of 2012. And basically it would be a referendum on the EU versus Russia's Commonwealth. But Yankovic just fled. He lost his nerve. And we know what he left behind. He left behind evidence of corruption with all these luxuries. He had an estate that was ridiculously luxurious. And he fled the country, unlike Zelensky, who has stayed. And he resurfaced in Russia, and he's been pretty quiet ever since. He just has disappeared from public view. But meanwhile, in the vacuum, the opposition set up the presidential elections, which they won. At about this time, some strange-looking armed men began to creep in to the Crimea, and they seized the infrastructure. This is what Putin says in his 2021 essay last July, looking back. He said, sure, there was legitimate public discontent on the way that the EU preliminary agreement had been reversed, but that it was cynically exploited by the Western countries who supported a coup. And he complains that a lot of the nationalist groups that came out against it were aggressive anti-Russians, Russia-phobia, and this is these people eventually are going to become Nazis. And he talks about how people who speak Russian language are discriminated against and they're going to disappear. It's kind of like a cultural genocide. And we had a spiritual unity and it was destroyed by these people. All right, so I think we'll get on a little bit to religion. I'll just do this real quick because Carol contributed something this week. Here, there's been religious differences. There's a lot of religious heterodoxy in the Ukraine, blending of Russian and Polish, if you will, religious beliefs over the years. And even within the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine declared their independence from the Orthodox Church of Russia, and that was blessed by Pompeo. There was an essay that Ramsey had us read from Foreign Affairs that was very interesting, that addressed the religious machinations between the Catholic religion coming from Krakow, which was the head of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth early on, and the Orthodox Church. But in 1596, a compromise was reached, a sort of halfway house between Catholicism and the Orthodox, where the Pope was still acknowledged, but Orthodox ritual was followed, and priests were allowed to marry, as they are in the Orthodox Church. And basically, the Ukrainian nobility had been what Reed calls Polonized. And those traditions still live on today. But Carol had a question about abortion in the Ukraine, which sent us to reading up a little bit more. And this compromise in the 16th century that limited Catholic strictures allows Zelensky to answer a question about abortion. The interviewer says, you know, there's such a public outcry when the government in Poland outlaws abortion. There were huge protests, and Zelensky weighs in and says, well, abortion should not be banned. It's a personal choice. There needs to be less impingement on human freedom. Now, and when it comes to religion and Zelensky, of course, he's Jewish, but a politician in the Ukraine can take this mid position on abortion. All right, so I think that's a good place to stop and take your questions, and we'll go from there. Well, if there are no questions, I would end by saying, as we look ahead, I'd like for you to at least consider the possibility of doing California history. So I'll send out a copy of the table of contents of that book that I started today's talk with, and we'll go from there. Okay.
Thank you, John.
Is this the end of the Ukraine stuff then?
No, I got one more.
Oh, okay.
A little more detail on the Maidan battle and how that continued. A little bit more about Putin's machinations in the eastern Ukraine with Luhansk and Donetsk. So we'll just basic, and I'm going to stop at 2014. I am not going to go beyond that.
Huh. Thank you, John. 2 o'clock then.
Thank you.
2 o'clock is our time. 2 o'clock Tuesday.
Okay, see you all next week, 2 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.